In February 1944, a bitter wind swept across Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, carrying the metallic scent of aviation fuel and snow. Inside a drafty hangar, a handful of engineers huddled around a sleek P-51 Mustang, its aluminum skin gleaming under floodlights. The Packard-built Merlin V1657 engine throbbed impatiently, every piston trembling as the throttle eased forward. For months they'd chased detonation limits and broken valves, but today the test wasn't about hardware. It was about what filled the tank. The mixture inside those fuel lines wasn't standard 100 octane. It was a purple-dyed experimental blend the chemists at Wright Field's fuels branch had labeled Grade 150. Nobody outside the lab understood how it worked, only that it contained new hydrocarbon chains and tetraethyl lead ratios, high enough to scare maintenance crews. The risk was simple. Either the engine would sing, or it would scatter its pistons across the runway. When the pilot pushed the throttle past 60 inches of mercury, the roar that followed silenced every conversation. 70. 75. Instead of coughing itself apart, the Merlin smoothed into a continuous bellow, the propeller disc flashing like liquid silver. Instrument needles hovered steady where they should have quivered. 1,120 horsepower. Not a misprint, not a fluke. The impossible, verified. Mechanics glanced at one another, wide-eyed. The smell of burned lead and hot oil filled the hangar. Halfway through the run, the control officer whispered the words that would echo through Allied aviation. No detonation. What they'd witnessed wasn't an incremental gain. It was a chemical revolution. A gallon of fuel had just rewritten the equation of air power. If you thought the P-51's legend was forged by design alone, think again. The secret behind Allied dominance was hidden in its tanks. Subscribe and follow as we uncover the unseen science that turned fuel into a weapon. As the Merlin wound down, the test pilot climbed out grinning, frost steaming from his flight jacket. He wiped a smear of purple residue from the cowling and muttered, "This stuff changes everything." No one doubted him. In that February dusk, among the echoes of a cooling engine, America had just lit the fuse of a new kind of warfare, one measured not in bullets, but in octane. The next morning, February 19th, 1944, laboratory lights glowed long before sunrise inside the fuel branch analysis room at Wright Field. Rows of beakers, condensers, and distillation columns shimmered beneath pale fluorescent bulbs as engineers pored over last night's data. The test had defied their equations, and now every chemist wanted to know why. The secret lay not in the engine's steel, but in the invisible dance of molecules within that purple liquid. Traditional 100-octane fuel, used since 1942, relied heavily on isooctane, a hydrocarbon with decent detonation resistance. But beyond that threshold, the fuel self-ignited under compression, destroying pistons and bearings. The chemist's breakthrough came from a wartime miracle of petroleum science. Catalytic cracking, pioneered by French-born engineer Eugène Udry, and scaled by Standard Oil refineries. By breaking long hydrocarbon chains into shorter, more volatile forms, and saturating them with aromatic compounds, they achieved stability at manifold pressures no piston engine had ever survived. The addition of tetraethyl lead, measured in fractions of a gram per gallon, acted like armor inside the combustion chamber. It slowed the flame front, prevented pre-ignition, and allowed the Merlin's supercharger to generate boost levels once thought suicidal. In controlled bench tests, this purple blend absorbed compression energy with eerie calm, holding its structure where other fuels detonated like grenades. Across the Atlantic, British Air Ministry scientists refined the same concept, calling their early variant 100-150 grade. They mixed benzene and aromatic spirits to push the detonation threshold even higher. It wasn't long before Allied strategists realized that chemistry could accomplish what metallurgy could not: give existing engines free horsepower without adding weight or redesign. Meanwhile, German laboratories struggled under blockade. Their synthetic B4 and C3 fuels, derived from coal hydrogenation, contained impurities that limited performance to roughly 96 octane. To compensate, Luftwaffe mechanics leaned out fuel mixtures, risking catastrophic engine wear. The contrast was brutal. While American P-51s roared higher and faster with every throttle inch, Messerschmitts fought their own chemistry. By spring, the purple fuels formula was stamped confidential, distribution restricted. What had begun as an experiment now stood as the Allies' invisible advantage. No weapon could match its subtlety. It didn't pierce armor or shatter runways. It simply allowed pilots to stay aloft longer, climb steeper, and fight on their own terms. In the quiet hum of those labs, the men in oil-stained coats knew they had stumbled upon something greater than an additive. They had discovered the chemistry of victory, and the war in the sky would never burn the same again. By March 1944, the quiet experiment at Wright Field had exploded into a national priority. In Washington, General Jimmy Doolittle, newly appointed commander of the 8th Air Force, understood exactly what those purple fuel samples meant. A veteran of pre-war racing planes and chemical engineering himself, Doolittle had once written his thesis on octane ratings. Now, as bomber losses over Europe mounted, he realized that unleashing the full potential of the Mustang's Merlin engine could change everything. He ordered immediate coordination between the Army Air Force's Materiel Command, Standard Oil of New Jersey, and Anglo-American refineries in Avonmouth, Grangemouth, Baton Rouge, and Baytown. Production quotas soared overnight. The numbers were staggering. By June 1944, Allied refineries produced over 53 million gallons of 150-grade aviation gasoline, dyed purple to prevent mix-ups with the older 100-130 blend. Scaling this miracle fuel demanded an industrial ballet. Rail cars lined up for miles at refinery gates. Tankers crossed the Atlantic under constant U-boat threat, each carrying enough high-performance gasoline to keep a fighter group airborne for weeks. At Liverpool docks, workers pumped the volatile liquid into steel drums marked P-51 Use Only, their gloves stained violet by the dye that symbolized Allied technological might. Inside these refineries, engineers worked under blackout conditions, adjusting Howdrey catalytic cracking units to squeeze out every drop of high-octane yield. Safety officers wore asbestos aprons as they monitored reactors running at 900 degrees off, knowing a single spark could erase the entire facility. Yet the urgency was relentless. Every extra horsepower meant fewer names added to casualty lists over Germany. Back at Wright Field, test logs multiplied. Engine after engine ran flawlessly on the purple blend, sustaining pressures once thought impossible. The results reached Doolittle's desk within days. He read the data and wrote a simple order to his operations staff: implement 150 where available, immediate effect. In April, the first combat squadrons received the new fuel. Crews at RAF Leiston, Bottisham, and Debden drained their old stocks, flushing the tanks of their P-51Ds to make room for the potent purple gasoline. Mechanics marveled at its sharp, sweet odor and thick texture. Pilots, briefed on the expected power increase, called it rocket fuel. But Doolittle knew it was more than that. It was a logistical triumph born from chemistry and courage, a supply chain built not of weapons, but of willpower. Behind every dogfight to come, hidden beneath aluminum and armor, would flow the lifeblood of industrial ingenuity. 150-grade fuel, the Allies' silent weapon of supremacy. May 1944. Over the gray expanse of the North Sea, vapor trails sliced the morning sky as P-51Ds from the 357th Fighter Group climbed toward 30,000 feet. Inside the cockpit of one Mustang, Captain Clarence "Bud" Anderson advanced the throttle until the manifold pressure needle quivered at 75 inches. The Packard-built Merlin responded with a feral growl, smoother, deeper, and infinitely stronger than before. The aircraft surged forward, pressing him into the seat. What had once been a 437 MIF ceiling now edged toward an astonishing 490. Pilots felt it instantly. Takeoff rolls shortened, acceleration off the deck became violent, and high-altitude responsiveness turned razor-sharp. Mechanics confirmed it in the numbers. Cylinder head temperatures dropped slightly while supercharger boost climbed beyond 25 pounds per square inch. Every gauge whispered the same message: the purple fuel worked. The first true test came on May 13th, when escort formations met Jagerschwader 26 near Münster. German radar plotted the incoming waves as standard Mustangs, yet within minutes, Luftwaffe pilots realized something was different. Climbing Bf-109Gs, still running on synthetic C3 fuel, couldn't hold pursuit angles. At 25,000 feet, their engines began to knock and lose manifold pressure, while the P-51s kept gaining speed. Radio chatter crackled across the German frequency bands. "They are faster. Impossible." Back at Leiston, combat film confirmed the physics. Gun camera reels showed Mustangs closing from incredible distances, firing short bursts, and then streaking past before the enemy could even react. Intelligence officers noted that Luftwaffe tactics were visibly unraveling. Defensive spirals that once escaped American pursuit now ended in fireballs. Engineers at Wright Field monitored the reports daily. Each after-action summary fed into new technical bulletins, recommendations on spark timing, boost limits, and fuel mixture curves. The British Ministry of Aircraft Production soon authorized permanent operational clearance for 150-grade fuel across all Merlin 66, 70, and V1650 series engines. Even bomber crews noticed the change. The B-17 and B-24 formations flying toward Berlin reported cleaner fighter cover. No breaks, no sudden disappearances over target zones. The Mustangs were simply staying with them, all the way in and out. To Luftwaffe analysts, this invisible chemistry appeared like sorcery. Reports reaching Hermann Göring's desk described American engines with impossible endurance. The Reichsmarshal reportedly stared at one such document and muttered, "If that's true, the war in the air is finished." Because by spring 1944 it was. The invisible war, fought in laboratories, refineries, and test stands, had finally reached the clouds. June 7, 1944, the day after D-Day. Over the shattered fields of Normandy, contrails crisscrossed a sky already thick with the echoes of invasion. P-51. Mustangs from the 352nd and 361st Fighter Groups prowled in loose formations, engines humming with the deep resonance of unleashed potential. Their tanks brimmed with the new 150-grade fuel, a purple alchemy that had turned aluminum and steel into predatory grace. The Luftwaffe had sent everything it could still fly. Jagdgeschwader 2 and 26 scrambled Bf-109Gs and FW-190As from French bases near Dreux and Évreux, desperate to stem the tide. But the difference was immediate and brutal. American pilots could now climb past 35,000 feet in under 9 minutes, engage, and still return with power to spare. German aircraft struggled to reach them, engines coughing on brittle synthetic blends that lacked the richness of Allied gasoline. Captain John Bennett of the 352nd described his first interception. "They tried to dive away at 400, maybe 420 miles per hour. We were still closing." His wingman confirmed gun camera footage, showing the blue-nosed Mustang accelerating past its prey, an event that had once been unthinkable. German ace Günther Rall later admitted in post-war interviews, "We knew something had changed. Their engines sounded different, harder, stronger. You could not catch them anymore. The fight was over before it began." At 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, analysts compiled kill ratios that stunned even Doolittle's staff. Between June and August 1944, fighter escort losses dropped by nearly 40%, while Luftwaffe attrition spiked catastrophically. Entire squadrons vanished within weeks. The 56th and 78th Fighter Groups reported engagements where P-51s routinely returned with unused ammunition. The enemy simply couldn't stay in the fight long enough. By late summer, pilots began noticing subtler advantages. High boost at lower throttle meant smoother cruise settings and extended range, allowing deeper penetration into enemy territory. Missions to Merseburg, Regensburg, and Berlin became routine rather than exceptional. German engineers tried to respond. Emergency programs pushed MW-50 methanol water injection into frontline aircraft, but without sufficient high-octane base fuel, gains were fleeting. Engines overheated, spark plugs fouled, and detonation damage became epidemic. For the Allies, every flight became proof that chemistry had rewritten the laws of air combat. The Mustang was no longer just a plane, It was an idea, the manifestation of industrial intelligence harnessed against tyranny. As one pilot wrote in his logbook that summer, "We used to chase shadows. Now the shadows run from us." August 1944. Deep inside the sprawling laboratories of Standard Oil's Baton Rouge facility, engineers in white coveralls huddled around glass distillation columns that glowed like molten towers. The war in the skies might have been fought by pilots, but the real battle for supremacy was now raging inside these steel chambers. Each flask, valve, and condenser was part of a quiet revolution, the science that kept Mustangs faster, hotter, and deadlier than anything Germany could field. At the center of it all was Eugene Houdry, the French-born chemist whose catalytic cracking process had transformed aviation fuel from a crude distillate into a scientific weapon. His method, forcing heavy hydrocarbons through clay-based catalysts under extreme pressure, produced an unprecedented yield of isooctane, the molecule that resisted detonation under supercharged compression. It was the chemical soul of the new 150 grade blend. To stabilize it, American engineers mixed tetraethyl lead, a silvery toxic compound that suppressed engine knock at unimaginable boost pressures. The result was an explosive paradox, a liquid volatile enough to burn through the sky yet stable enough to push piston engines past mechanical limits. When refined to precise tolerances, this purple gasoline could deliver sustained manifold pressures of 80 inches without pre-ignition, a figure that turned 1,490 horsepower into 1,720 and made the P-51 practically untouchable. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, at the Avonmouth refinery near Bristol, British chemists fine-tuned blending formulas to suit varying climate conditions over Europe. They adjusted vapor pressures, added antioxidants, and conducted tests using captured Luftwaffe engines for comparison. One British technician recorded in his log, "The Germans rely on coal. We rely on chemistry." The data proved him right. German C3 synthetic fuel, derived from Fischer-Tropsch coal liquefaction, barely reached 95 octane under ideal conditions. It burned dirty, degraded quickly, and produced critical shortages of aviation-grade additives like lead and isooctane. No amount of engineering could compensate for the chemical gap widening every month. At Wright Field, American analysts tracked the numbers with military precision. Each sample sent back from combat zones was analyzed for contaminants and performance deviations. Reports indicated that engines running exclusively on 150 grade showed up to 12% lower wear rates, an unexpected bonus in sustained operations. To the pilots, it was invisible magic. But to the scientists, it was the triumph of applied chemistry, industrial courage, and global logistics, a union that turned raw oil into air superiority. The Mustang's roar wasn't just mechanical. It was molecular, forged in laboratories where beakers replaced bullets. September 1944. The dawn over occupied France was streaked with contrails, white scars tracing the collapse of an empire. As the Allied armadas advanced toward Germany's borders, the Mustangs flew higher, faster, and longer than any enemy pilot had thought possible. At 29,000 feet, condensation crystallized on canopies as P-51 formations swept past shattered Luftwaffe bases, their Packard Merlins singing on a rhythm that no German fuel could replicate. At RAF Debden, Colonel Thomas J.J. Christian Jr. briefed the 361st Fighter Group before their Berlin escort. His message was blunt. "You're not just covering bombers anymore. You're dismantling their air force." With 150 grade fuel coursing through their tanks, his men could now climb with B-17s, chase Me-109Gs across cloud tops, and still have enough endurance to hunt stragglers on the return leg. The psychological shift was total. The hunters had become executioners. Above the Ruhr, Luftwaffe pilots scrambled from dwindling reserves. Synthetic fuel shortages had reduced flight hours to a fraction of what they'd been 2 years earlier. Engines coughed black smoke, spark plugs fouled, and even training flights were rationed. The contrast was devastating. German ground crews whispered about purple gas, a mythical American concoction that turned aircraft into phantoms. Their own tanks contained fuel so diluted with benzene that it corroded gaskets and froze at altitude. By October, Allied Mustangs had extended their dominance into the missile belt of northern France, intercepting V-1 flying bombs launched toward London. The 150-octane mix allowed them to chase down the pulse-jet drones at speeds exceeding 480 mph, a feat previously reserved for short bursts that now became routine. Flight Lieutenant Ken Collier of the RAF recalled, "We were diving past 490. The controls stiffened, but she held. That purple fuel gave the Mustang a new heart." Intelligence summaries recorded the Luftwaffe's disintegration in cold figures. From January to December 1944, German fighter losses exceeded 17,000 aircraft. Factories like Messerschmitt Regensburg couldn't replace them fast enough, starved not just of metal, but of chemistry. Even advanced aircraft, the FW-190D9 and Me-262, suffered from inadequate high-performance fuel, their engines throttled by scarcity. Meanwhile, at Allied command posts, fuel convoys became as sacred as ammunition. Each tanker truck was an artery of victory, its violet contents worth more than gold. Officers called it liquid air power, a phrase that summed up the silent war fought not with bullets, but with molecules. By autumn's end, German skies belonged to the Allies, not through sheer numbers, but through the invisible genius that flowed in every gallon of 150-grade fuel. November 1944. Allied air doctrine was no longer just about escorting bombers. It was about erasing enemy resistance from the skies. The arrival of 150-grade fuel had forced a doctrinal revolution across every fighter command from East Anglia to the Ardennes. What began as an experimental additive had become the blueprint for air supremacy. At the 8th Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe, planners redrew mission profiles. Longer range meant deeper penetration. Leipzig, Dresden, even the Oder River itself. The P-51D, once limited by return fuel margins, could now loiter over targets, diving repeatedly into enemy airspace with near impunity. Bomber formations, which had once suffered catastrophic attrition, now reached their objectives with the precision of an industrial machine. Engineers and tacticians called it operational elasticity, the newfound ability to fight on their own terms. For the Luftwaffe, this shift was catastrophic. Airfields that once served as launch points for interception became graveyards. Reconnaissance photographs from late 1944 showed rows of abandoned fighters, their tanks empty, propellers rusting in the cold. With synthetic refineries at Leuna, Brux, and Pölitz reduced to rubble by relentless bombing, Germany's aviation network was strangled from within. The few aircraft that managed to take off did so on impure low-grade substitutes, suffering mid-air failures before ever reaching Allied formations. At Wright Field, American scientists continued refining flight data from returning squadrons. Their reports documented astonishing consistency. Engines ran cleaner, spark erosion was minimal, and maintenance intervals lengthened by nearly a third. The chemistry of 150 grade wasn't just extending range, it was extending lives. Every extra hour an engine ran flawlessly meant one fewer pilot lost to mechanical failure over enemy territory. Colonel Earl Partridge noted in a December briefing, "Fuel has become our air strategy. Airplanes are merely its delivery system." His words reflected a deeper truth, that science, not sheer numbers, had rewritten the rules of war. The Mustang's dominance had less to do with wingspan or armament and everything to do with the unseen perfection inside its tanks. By winter, the German High Command understood that no countermeasure could restore parity. The Allied fuel network, refineries, pipelines, convoys, had become an unbreakable chain. From Louisiana, crude to English refueling stations, every link turned chemical theory into battlefield reality. The result was doctrine forged not by generals, but by chemists. A new kind of warfare where the laboratory became the arsenal. December 1944. Snow covered the airfields of East Anglia, muffling the sound of engines warming at dawn. Beneath canvas covers, ground crews brushed frost from Mustang wings, their breath mixing with the vapor of preheated fuel lines. In nearby tents, pilots studied weather maps of Belgium and Luxembourg. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and the Luftwaffe had returned to the skies for one final, desperate counterattack. Operation Bodenplatte, January 1st, 1945. At first light, over 900 German fighters roared across the front, targeting Allied air bases in the Low Countries. It was their last coordinated strike, and their last illusion of strength. The Mustangs scrambled from Asch, St. Trond, and Ofoven, engines erupting with the full fury of 150-grade fuel. Within minutes, the skies dissolved into chaos. Yet even amidst surprise and confusion, the advantage of chemistry held firm. American pilots described how their engines bit through the cold like it wasn't there. Superchargers spun effortlessly, maintaining boost even in freezing air where German propellers stiffened and carburetors froze. The result was decisive. Within an hour, more than 300 Luftwaffe aircraft lay burning across the snow, victims of precision, endurance, and molecular superiority. Allied losses were minimal. The Reich had gambled everything on fuel it no longer possessed. At Wright Field, analysts received fragments of captured documents describing Germany's frantic experiments with ersatz high-octane substitutes, mixtures of benzene, alcohol, and nitrobenzene. They failed catastrophically. Compressors detonated, valves melted, and engines seized mid-flight. A single Allied drum of 150 grade was worth more than a squadron's worth of German aviation spirits. In post-war testimony, Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland admitted, "We were flying on desperation. Our fuel had no life in it." His engineers had pleaded for better additives, but bombed-out refineries made miracles impossible. The once proud air arm of the Reich had been reduced to relics, cannibalized for parts and fueled by chemistry unworthy of war. Meanwhile, Allied sorties intensified. From Debden to Leisten, Mustangs escorted bombers across the Rhine, their performance unchanged even after hundreds of missions. The 150-grade blend had proven not only powerful, but astonishingly stable, a chemical constant in a war of chaos. By March 1945, as Allied tanks rolled toward the Elbe, the skies were silent. The last Messerschmitts were grounded, their fuel drums empty, their pilots grounded by chemistry itself. In hangars still reeking of burnt benzene, Germany's engineers finally understood. They hadn't lost the war to airplanes. They had lost it to molecules. April 1945. The war in Europe was nearly over. Across silent airfields once roaring with life, rows of Mustangs sat gleaming in the weak spring sunlight. Their propellers were still, but inside their tanks lingered the faint violet stain of the fuel that had carried them to victory. Mechanics walked between the aircraft with a reverence that bordered on disbelief. For 2 relentless years, the sound of the Merlin had been the heartbeat of freedom, and its pulse had been powered by a liquid miracle. Historians would later record the statistics. Higher compression ratios, 80-inch boost, 1,120 horsepower. But numbers could never capture the human scale of what 150-grade fuel had done. It had extended lives, of bomber crews who made it home, of pilots who survived dogfights once considered suicidal. It had turned chemistry into courage. Every takeoff was an act of engineering faith. Every safe landing, a testament to minds that fought the war from behind glass walls and refinery gates. In the ruins of Germany, Allied investigators found the remnants of the Reich's synthetic fuel plants, twisted reactors, scorched pipelines, and laboratories abandoned in haste. On the walls of Leuna, someone had written in chalk, "Ohne Benzin, kein Krieg," without fuel, no war. It was the final confession of an empire undone not just by force, but by science it could not match. At Wright Field, the same engineers who had once risked explosions in test cells now studied the engines that had returned from Europe. The data told a story of triumph written in oil and lead, reduced wear, flawless combustion, sustained power. They had not only built an engine, they had designed endurance itself. General Jimmy Doolittle, now preparing to return home, reportedly stood beside a Mustang one afternoon and ran his hand along the fuselage. "They'll talk about pilots and dogfights," he said quietly, "but it was fuel that won the air." He wasn't wrong. Behind every burst of machine gun fire, every contrail over Europe, there had flowed a tide of purple energy, born of laboratories, refined through hardship, perfected in flight. When the engines finally fell silent, their echo carried something deeper than victory. It carried proof that intellect, chemistry, and determination could outfight tyranny. And as the violet stain faded from the world's most powerful fuel, it left behind a truth every pilot knew in his heart, that wars are won not just by courage, but by the brilliance that gives courage wings.